When Sony announced on the 21st of August 2025 that every model of the PlayStation 5 would be going up in price by $50 in the US, the backlash was instant. The new figures were spelt out clearly: $549.99 for the base console, $499.99 for the digital edition, and an eye-watering $749.99 for the Pro. Sony waved the move away as the result of economic pressures and the usual catch-all excuses about global costs, but few seemed convinced. Some chalked it up to tariffs and supply issues, others to wider economic turbulence, yet no matter how you spin it, it remains one of the most bewildering decisions from a company that has long styled itself as the reliable anchor of console gaming. Think about it, we are 5 years into the PS5's life cycle, and instead of receiving the traditional mid-generation price drop we've all come to expect, Sony has opted to do the exact opposite. They've not only broken precedent, they've done so at a moment when ordinary households are being squeezed harder than ever. It's absolutely crazy that they think their customers will simply keep paying more. After all, the cost of living crisis isn't some abstract talking point, it's the daily reality of millions of people. As one frustrated fan had vented directly on Sony's own PlayStation blog, in a challenging economy, you would think the price would go down, not up. And that simple observation cuts to the heart of the matter, because at the end of the day, Sony isn't reading the room, they're just checking your wallet, and apparently they've decided it's still not empty enough. In contradiction to the world we actually live in, Sony claims that this is just a business as usual, but the timing, the tone, and the sheer audacity of the move suggest completely otherwise. And once you've broken that unspoken trust between company and customer, it's far harder to repair than it ever was to maintain in the first place. PlayStation really couldn't have picked a worse time for this. So let's break down why this isn't just a dreadful business, but also why, as I'll show you throughout this video, there are far better options Sony could have taken. There's nothing worse than companies trying to squeeze us for more cash, especially when most of us are already counting every penny. That's why it's such a relief to see that there are still places offering proper value. Right now, you can grab 40% off Black Myth, Wukong, 24% off Mafia the Old Country, 22% off Elden Ring Night's Reign, and a frankly ridiculous 43% off Expedition 33, 29% off Stellar Blade, and even Wu Chang Fallen Feathers is sitting there with a chunky discount, and that's before you even start digging through the thousands of other bargains waiting for you. So please do yourself a favour, make a shopping list, fill up your basket, and laugh at the Wall Street investors expecting us to pay full retail price. Links are down below. Happy shopping, and I hope you enjoy the rest of this video. For decades, there has been one sacred rule in the console business. The most expensive day to buy your system is launch day. You splash out at the start, then as time goes on and the technology matures, the price steadily drops until the machine becomes affordable to almost anyone. It's such a predictable cycle that consumers have relied on it to plan out when they'll make the leap. That is, until Sony decided to tear up the rulebook. Historically, PlayStation consoles haven't just dropped a little, they've plummeted. The original PlayStation launched in 1995 for $299. Within 8 months, it was $199. By the end of the decade, you could snag one for $99 and eventually just $49. The PlayStation 2 followed the same pattern, $299 at launch in 2000, halved to $150 within 4 years. Even the notoriously overpriced PlayStation 3, which hit shelves in 2006 at $499 for the 20GB model and $599 for the 60GB version, saw its price slashed to $299 by 2009. These price drops weren't flashy stunts, they were the very engine that drove console adoption. Yet here we are, 5 years into the PS5's life cycle, and rather than cutting prices, Sony has raised them. The absurdity of this reversal is obvious when you look at the numbers, where past generations often saw prices slashed by around half within 3 years. Today we're talking about cuts of maybe 15 or 30% at best, and the steady staircase downward has flattened into little more than a shallow incline, if not a climb back up. This holiday season will certainly be interesting, but not in the way anyone was hoping. Instead of the long-anticipated price cuts that would finally make the console more affordable, buyers are staring down the surreal reality that a 5-year-old PS5 now costs more than it did at launch. But what is truly ridiculous is that it doesn't even need to be this way. Former PlayStation boss Sean Layden recently said the quiet part out loud. How many of us can really tell the difference between 90 frames per second and 120 frames per second? That single question posed in an interview with GamesIndustry.biz cuts right to the heart of the problem. We've reached a technological plateau where the returns for consumers are diminishing, yet Sony insists on charging premium prices for improvements that most people cannot perceive. Take the recently released PlayStation 5 Pro, for example. On paper, it sounds monstrous. Digital Foundry highlighted its 33.5 teraflops of compute performance compared to the base PS5's 10.23. But the truth is that while it's the perfect example of hardware that flatters in spec sheets, it does little to transform the actual experience that the average consumer would actually notice or care about. CNET put it bluntly after going hands-on with the PlayStation 5 Pro. Sometimes subtle upgrades will not be worth the price. And they're right, you can drop an extra $250 on the Pro model, but unless you're the kind of player who stares at frame-time graphs for fun, you're unlikely to notice much difference. This disconnect is most obvious with ray tracing, a feature Sony loves to tout. A Hardware Unboxed survey of over 50,000 players revealed that 52% do not typically use ray tracing in their games. Why? Because the performance cost is too high, the gains are too minimal, and often the end result looks worse once compromises like resolution scaling are factored in. Yet, this is one of the Pro's biggest selling points. The reality is that Sony has built a machine for a niche market of self-described superfans while alienating the broader player base. As one player wryly commented on VGBs, "For my old eyeballs, that tiny jump is not worth the price." And that's the issue in a nutshell. The Pro is not about delivering mass market value, it's about squeezing the most dedicated few for a little extra cash. Former PlayStation boss Sean Layden believes the brand should be going in a very different direction from what they currently seem to be pursuing, offering up a very different philosophy. Consoles should be made cheaper and simpler, rather than wasting everyone's time and money building increasingly complex, expensive hardware to sell marginal improvements. They should be actually focusing on what most consumers want in 2025, affordability, rather than garish vanity specs. Let's state the obvious, if there was ever a moment when a company should avoid squeezing its customers for more, it's now. And the fact that PlayStation seem blind to this is tone deaf, to say the least. After all, according to KPMG's 2025 Consumer Pulse survey, discretionary entertainment budgets have already fallen from 15% to 12% of household income. That's a 20% cut in what families have available to spend on things like consoles, games and subscriptions. It means the pie Sony is fighting for isn't growing, it's shrinking. Deloitte's data is even starker. About half of US households have no money left over at the end of the month. Half. And into this climate, Sony has the audacity to tack another $50 onto a 5-year-old console. For millions of people, that isn't just frustrating, it's the difference between being able to afford a system at all or writing gaming off entirely. But the closer we look at the situation, the more delusional PlayStation increasingly look. The price of console gaming is the tip of the iceberg for most people's worries at present. A Wells Fargo study shows that Americans are already living in a constant state of sticker shock, with actual prices for everyday experiences coming in 55 to 200% higher than expected. Going out for dinner, a concert, or even downloading a new game all costs more than people anticipate. The last thing consumers needed was another nasty surprise, but Sony was more than happy to provide one. Serious Gaming described it best. This move creates a dangerous precedent. The price on the box is no longer a ceiling, but a starting point that can be adjusted based on market volatility. In other words, the days when you could trust that the number on the launch sticker was the most you'd ever have to pay are now over. And once those floodgates are open, history tells us that they don't close. As one Reddit user bleakly predicted, once the price of something goes up and people keep buying it, it ain't ever going back down. That quote is as much about human behaviour as it is about Sony. Companies should know that if consumers swallow the first hike, they'll likely stomach the next. By choosing this exact moment of financial fragility to raise prices, Sony hasn't just made life harder for its customers, it's signalled that, in their eyes, even an economic crisis isn't a reason to ease off, it's an excuse to push even harder and justify their greedy practices. If Sony's timing wasn't already bad enough, it becomes downright suicidal when you look at the competitive landscape. Their rivals haven't exactly been saints when it comes to pricing, but they've all been far more shrewd in how they present value. As Serious Gaming put it, Microsoft is now in the position of a lifetime. By simply doing nothing, they can frame the Xbox as a platform that respects your budget. That's because Xbox no longer lives or dies by hardware sales. Jason Ronald, Xbox's vice president, explained the shift clearly to The Verge. We see there's lots of players using Game Pass Ultimate to access cloud gaming. That's their primary way, or additional way to play games on the go. Microsoft isn't trying to gouge people with another black box under the television, it's selling accessibility. Whether you're on PC, mobile, or a modest Series S, the entire strategy is about making the ecosystem available anywhere. Of course, Microsoft isn't immune to its own price controversies. Final Boss Gaming pointed out that the Xbox Series S is now a worse deal than Sony's PS5 Slim Digital. And yet, this misses the larger point. Microsoft doesn't care if the box itself looks overpriced because the box is no longer the product. The product is Game Pass. And as Business Insider reminded everyone, Game Pass gives you all Microsoft Studios' brand new games day one. Compared to Sony, where you're paying a premium subscription for old catalogue entries while still coughing up at full price for new releases. Nintendo, meanwhile, continues to play an entirely different game. Yes, the Switch 2 launched at an eye-watering $449.99, but Nintendo can get away with it because its first-party output is unlike anything else. In theory, they can charge more simply because their hardware and software ecosystem isn't interchangeable with PC or Xbox. IGN reinforces point by noting that the original Switch held its $299.99 price for 8 years, not because of tariffs or inflation, but because Nintendo knows exactly how much people will pay for Mario, Zelda, and Pokemon. What Sony has failed to grasp is that both rivals have a story to tell their customers. Microsoft can boast value through access, Nintendo can boast value through exclusivity. Sony, they're just charging more for the same odd thing, which is just idiocy. And if there's one thing more dangerous for a platform than its high prices, it's alienating the very people who have stuck with you through thick and thin. Sony has managed to do both. And through their continuous predatory practices, their relationship with its customers is continuously eroding. The closure of the PlayStation Stars loyalty program earlier this year became the clearest signal yet of how little value Sony now places on consumer goodwill. For those unfamiliar, it was pitched as a rewards scheme where players could earn points by buying games or completing small challenges, with the promise that those points could later be redeemed for discounts or digital collectibles. On paper, it sounded like an easy win, a way of rewarding loyal customers for simply sticking with the brand. The reality was very different. The point system was weighed so heavily in Sony's favour that redeeming even a single game often required well over $1,000 in purchases. The digital trinkets, meanwhile, were viewed as little more than cheap distractions. Instead of making players feel valued, the program quickly became a running joke, a supposed loyalty scheme that rewarded only the most extravagant spenders while leaving ordinary customers with nothing of worth. So when Sony pulled the plug, it didn't feel like a minor course correction. It just felt like confirmation that the company has no real interest in rewarding its community at all. A program that was already seen as a hollow cash grab has now been quietly swept aside, leaving players even more alienated than before. And that pattern of disregard extends far beyond reward schemes. On Trustpilot, PlayStation services sit at a dismal 1.2 out of 5 stars, with complaints ranging from ignored fraud reports to dismissive customer service. One user summed up the experience in a single damning sentence: PlayStation support is rude and unhelpful. That's not exactly the kind of endorsement you want from the people funding your ecosystem. What is even more embarrassing is that their reputation problem isn't anecdotal either. Research compiled by Penji found that Sony was the most hated brand on the list, earning the highest rate of negative tweets in 10 different countries. That level of hostility doesn't happen overnight. It's the result of years of nickel and diming, bungled communication, and sheer arrogance. Even Sony's most loyal supporters are starting to buckle. On Reddit, one longtime fan admitted, "I have been a strong supporter, but they've thrown curveballs back at fans." That quote speaks volumes. These aren't casual observers or rival fanboys, they're PlayStation lifers who are finally questioning whether their loyalty is being taken for granted, and you don't have to look far to see why. Regarding these price hikes, IB Times reported, on social media, many users described the increase as unfair, with some accusing Sony of prioritising profits over players. This is a sort of backlash that erodes trust not just in a single decision, but in the brand as a whole. For decades, PlayStation was built on the idea that once you entered their ecosystem, you were treated as part of the family. Today, that relationship looks far more like exploitation. So, what can we make from all of this? Well, Sony would have you believe that these price hikes are the unavoidable result of tariffs and wider economic turbulence, but once you actually trace the timeline, that excuse collapses faster than a launch day Joy-Con. Back in April, months before the US tariff policy even came into play, Sony published a blog post explaining their decision to raise prices in Europe, Australia and New Zealand. Their reasoning? High inflation and fluctuating exchange rates. No mention of tariffs, no sudden surge in production costs, just the same vague, challenging environment line corporations trot out when they don't want to admit they're chasing margins. So, why the sudden squeeze? Dark Horizons may have provided the answer when they pointed out that these hikes came just a week after announcing record Q1 revenue of $6.47 billion. That doesn't exactly scream hardship, it screams profit maximisation dressed up as necessity. And let's not forget Sony isn't acting alone. As Rolling Stone noted, all three console giants, Sony, Microsoft and Nintendo, have raised prices in sync this year. That looks less like survival and more like an industry moving in lockstep to normalise charging more for ageing hardware. Tariffs, inflation, tough conditions. These are convenient smokescreens. The real story is a company taking advantage of uncertainty to quietly rewrite the rules of console pricing. Step back, and the bigger picture becomes painfully clear. By breaking the sacred tradition of console price cuts, by charging more for upgrades that barely register to the human eye, and by doing so in the middle of a global economic crunch, Sony has turned what should have been a moment of loyalty into a test of patience. Short-term revenue boosts may look great on a quarterly spreadsheet, but they hollow out the trust that sustains a platform for decades. But here's the irony, as Sean Layden put it, gaming should be getting cheaper and simpler if they expect the market to grow. Instead, Sony has chosen the opposite, more expensive, more complicated and more detached from everyday reality of the people who actually buy their machines. PlayStation may well enjoy a short-term bump from this price hike, but history shows that when giants lose touch with their audience, the fall is never far behind. There's nothing worse than companies trying to squeeze us for more cash, especially when most of us are already stretched thin. But do not forget that the good news is that there are still proper bargains out there. Right now, you can grab 40% off Black Myth Wukong, 24% off Mafia the Old Country, 22% off Elden Ring Night Rain, and a frankly ridiculous 43% off Expedition 33. 29% off Stellar Blade, and even Wu Chang Fallen Feathers is sitting there with a chunky discount, and that's before you even start digging through the thousands of other deals waiting for you. So do yourself a favour, stock up, save a bundle, and have a good laugh at the investors who think we'll happily pay full retail, or if you want to support what I do in a more personal way and access my behind the scenes cosplay library and more over on Patreon. See you all again soon.